Hello, namaste. Jefferson Glassie here with another book report. This is on the book Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, subtitled How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. It's a profound book. I've had to write up notes about it because I don't understand it. I'm trying to understand it. A lot of it makes sense, but I want to capture a lot of Tyson's words here, and I'll try to indicate where those words are versus my own words, but a lot of it is his words. Hope you're okay with that, Tyson. I'm just trying to share the knowledge that you've shared because it's so critical for us to really change our thinking, our consciousness, our values, something to be able to take humanity where we want it to be as opposed to let it go down, honestly. So, this is a profound book. I've been seriously attracted to the perspectives of Indigenous peoples for some time now, so that the title of the book, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, really grabbed me. I read the book twice, highlighting it in multi-colors to try to grasp and understand that Tyson is offering. It's complex and presents many differences from our own, or what we might call colonizer thinking. In some respects, it's all about seeing or maybe remembering. Tyson says, quote, "There's a pattern to the universe and everything in it. And there are knowledge systems and traditions that follow this pattern to maintain balance, to keep the temptations of narcissism in check. But recent traditions have emerged that break down creation systems like a virus, infecting complex patterns with artificial simplicity, exercising a civilizing control over what some see as chaos. The war between good and evil is in reality an imposition of stupidity and simplicity over wisdom and complexity." I'm thinking that our current Western perspective that's damaging so much is of the stupid and simple variety. So please allow me to try to summarize some of the main points Tyson seems to be making in this remarkable book so we can save the world. First, the title of the book refers to drawings in sand of symbols and things that have meaning in Aboriginal thought. I'm not going to try to show you or discuss these, and you can read about that if you want in the book. Tyson's proposition is that we have rarely in our modern world looked at sustainability issues through indigenous perspectives and thought processes, which are what he tries to explain to us in this book. For instance, Aboriginal people view everything as alive. Every rock is animate and sentient. Quote, "In this way of knowing, there is no difference between you, a stone, a tree, or a traffic light. From this perspective, there's no greater or lesser stone or rock. All things are the same." And from this, he says, the most destructive idea in existence is, I am greater than you. You are less than me. This is the source of all human misery. Aboriginal society was designed over thousands of years to deal with this problem, containing the excesses of malignant narcissists is a team effort. The basic protocols of, quote, this is a quote too, "The basic protocols of Aboriginal society, like most societies, include respecting and hearing all points of view. Narcissists demand this right, then refuse to allow others' points of view on the ground that any other opinion somehow infringes their freedom of speech or is offensive." Boy, that sounds like something we're observing now, doesn't it? They destroy the basic social contract of reciprocity which he says allows people to build a reputation of generosity based on sharing to ensure ongoing connectedness and support. Interesting. Shattering this framework of harmony with a few words of nasty gossip. They apply double standards and break down systems of give and take until every member of the social group becomes isolated, lost in a Darwinian struggle for power and dwindling resources that destroy everything. Yeah. Excuse me. All lawbreaking comes from this first evil thought, that original sin of placing yourself above the land or above other people. The first law of nature, according to Tyson, is that, quote, nothing is created or destroyed. It just moves and changes. So everything happens in cycles. He says, quote, the past, present, future are all one thing. One time, one place. Time is nonlinear and regenerates creation in endless cycles. Human kinship systems are in cycles too. Grandparents, parents, grandchildren, and all over again. Everything moves in cycles. And creation, quote, creation is in a constant state of motion, and we must move with it as a custodial species, or we will damage the system and doom ourselves. Nothing can be held, accumulated, stored. So he says we have to move and adapt within the systems that are also in constant states of movement and adaptation. And all this clashes with the understanding of the second peoples, us, because time is linear to us, with a beginning, a middle, and end, which ignores the cyclical approach actually in nature. He says we also view systems in isolation and leading to an inevitable end, ignoring that first law. He says second people focused on closed rather than open systems, which may lead to our obsession with creating fences, walls, borders, divides, and barriers. But we don't inhabit a closed system. So are we simply bucking the universe and trying to tame it to calm ourselves? That's my take on his perspective here. He also says that Western civilization has a remarkable ability to absorb, quote, absorb any object or idea, alter it, sanitize it, rebrand it, and market it. A good example, he says, is what the Romans did with Christianity. It was an ideology of poor and enslaved that threatened the Romans. So, quote, when torture and murder became ineffective as deterrents, the Romans just embraced Christianity and, quote, made it the state religion, rewriting the holy text to suit their needs and rebranding it as a new system of control. After millennia of dealing with such religions and illiberal governments, catastrophes, genocides, wars, climate disasters, humans in both indigenous and settler roles have unsurprisingly suffered great trauma. He calls it post-apocalyptic stress syndrome, from which they can really never return. Society always transitions to something new, and Tyson advises it would be good to, quote, get ahead of the game and begin creating cultures and societies of transition to lessen the impacts of this calamity on our communities. We need to start working with the land rather than against it. Our communities need to share knowledge with one another while maintaining their own unique systems grounded in the diverse landscapes they care for. He stresses that indigenous people moved with the land and they were custodians of the land. But settler mentality is just to keep doing things the same ways they remember doing them rather than adapting. As opposed to the closed system perspective of Western civilization, Tyson says it is clear to him that what seems like chaos through the natural world really has patterns and shapes that you can only discern with a holistic view. Quote, complex systems are adaptive, self-organizing, and patterned with logic that can be discerned and used. But it is a complexity that cannot function through external design and control. Now here's where Tyson talks about the management of systems. He says community members, whether fish, birds, humans, quote, need to operate autonomously under 3 or 4 basic rules. Self-organizing within groups, spaces, and data sets to form complex learning communities. This is the perspective you need to be a custodian rather than an owner of lands, communities, or knowledge. He says it requires relinquishing control and artificial power and, quote, immersion in the astounding patterns of creation that only emerge through the free movement of all agents and elements within a system. In other words, we must ride the natural patterns and cycles rather than trying to tame them. He says that, quote, pre-industrial cultures have worked within self-organizing systems for thousands of years to predict weather patterns, seasonal activity, and the dynamics of social groups, then manage responses to these complexities in non-intrusive ways to maintain some systemic balance. These systems cannot be controlled from the outside. They are equal parts interacting together. They were equal parts interacting together. Trying to impose top-down control does not work and destroys the systems. But interventions from within the system can be made in a healthy way. Tyson says, quote, Indigenous models of governance are based on respect for social, ecological, and knowledge systems and all their components or members. Unquote. Every aspect of the natural systems, including plants, animals, wind, lightning, etc., interacts in a complex kinship arrangement, all working together. He says, quote, the whole is intelligent, and each part carries the inherent intelligence of the entire system. Knowledge is therefore a living thing that is patterned within every person and being and object and phenomenon within creation. So that's an interesting concept. Knowledge is a living thing. In fact, from the Indigenous perspective, it seems everything is a living thing. Perhaps it is this assumption, essentially the non-hierarchical nature of the cosmos. That's my bird clock. Perhaps it is this assumption, essentially the non-hierarchical nature of the cosmos, that is key to management of the system. Tyson says respectful observation and interaction within the system are the only ways to see the patterns. You have to respect what you're seeing and look closely. You cannot know any part of it without respect. You cannot come to knowledge without respect. And the knowledge must be facilitated by custodians with no outside imposed authority or boss. That's an interesting concept for us, right? While the elders ensure the process, he says, quote, there is no centralized control in Aboriginal societies. Since Western societies are centralized, he surmises that this is the gulf that prevents conversations about sustainable solutions to our problems. He goes further and says that, quote, sustainable systems cannot function without the full autonomy and unique expression of each independent part of the interdependent whole. This seems to me the fatal flaw of authoritarian regimes, for example, but the integral feature of success in more egalitarian governance models. He also discusses a few simple operating guidelines or rules that make these systems effective. Diversify, connect, interact, and adapt. The diversification rule requires that individuals maintain their uniqueness and differences to prevent clustering into similar narcissistic mobs. It requires interacting with a wide variety of others in the system who are dissimilar and remaining open to other systems. The connectedness principle requires connecting in relationships with others in the system in pairs and then pairing with others. So sort of pairing throughout the systems. The key is interacting in relationships within your system and in other systems to facilitate the flow of living knowledge, transferring as much knowledge as possible to others, like a real free market of energy and resources. Adaptation is the most important attribute, he says, in which each person or part of the system allows themselves to be affected and transformed by the knowledge flowing through the systems. He says if you keep moving, following these 4 protocols, you will encounter systems of vibrant complexity that will draw you into their web, as with indigenous societies. He also talks about spirit and learning from Aboriginal perspectives that's kind of hard for me to follow in a way. He says that one can understand spirit through metaphors, which are the language of spirit. He says, whatever stories your cultural experience offers you, you can still perceive spirit through metaphor and bring it into balance enable you to step into your designated role as a custodian of reality. Some new cultures keep asking, why are we here? He says it's easy. This is why we're here. We look after things on the earth and in the sky and in the places in between. A very holistic perspective on our lives and interaction with this system here. He says true learning is like a spark of creation and an act of joy because it is an act of creation. Joy gives pleasure by increasing connectedness and complexity. Quote, there has to be an interaction between the abstract, just spirit, and the concrete, physical worlds of knowledge for the kind of complexity to develop fully. So it can't just be all physical. It has to involve spirit. Without such connection, he says, true learning cannot occur. He says that creative spark in learning is a process that allows us and will allow us to solve seemingly impossible problems. Climate change. The process is like taking a real-life event, dreaming it into metaphor, then manipulating the metaphor to gain understanding and innovating it back into the real world. He says the mind extends outside the brain. I believe this is true from what I've been learning. When we make meaning with people, places, objects, then we store information outside the brain in objects, places, and relationships. That is how spirit works. There is knowledge in your body, in your hands, in your hair, in your gut. Using your body consciously can unlock this knowledge. As custodians, use of metaphors is important because we can either increase or decrease our connection within creation. He also emphasizes the importance of story in indigenous cultures, and particularly what he calls yarning, which is more than just storytelling. It's more like a process, quote, for knowledge, production, inquiry, and transmission. It is a ritual that incorporates elements such as story, humor, gesture, mimicry, for consensus building, meaning making, and innovation. It has protocols of active listening, mutual respect, and building on what others have said rather than openly contradicting them or debating their ideas. The back and forth of yarning neutralizes grandstanding. Monologues are rare in indigenous societies, he said. Yarners sit in a group in a process that removes hierarchical barriers with no stage or audience. He says, quote, the end result of a yarn is a set of understandings, values, and directions shared by all members of the group in a loose consensus that is inclusive of diverse points of view. Tyson is saying, I think that this method of learning and knowledge exchange is far superior and more complex and effective than Western publication in schools, which are the main ways of enforcing the grand narratives of the controlling governments. He tells a fascinating history of how in Europe, thousands of years ago, the indigenous people called the Prusai, I believe, who lived in an area between modern Germany and Russia, eventually had their land stolen by this group called the Order of Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. He said, you've seen those images of gallant knights slaying beasts and dragons, but that was really representative of wiping out the indigenous people. The new system established by the knights, who were called the Prussians at this point, was really about wielding absolute power held by an organized central government. This Prussian government became powerful through stripping rights of its citizens and implementation of a powerful standing army which had not existed in Europe before. This is later on in the 13th century. The Prussians were then defeated by Napoleon in 1806 and decided at that point they needed to focus on the children to instill the necessary obedience to become powerful. What they did was not dissimilar, Tyson says, to domesticating animals. Separating the young from adults during daylight, confining them in closed space with limited stimulation, and use of reward and punishment to comply with purposeless tasks. In other words, public education in school. They extended adolescence from short rites of passage in indigenous societies, very short rites of passage from going from a child to adulthood, to years of long education, then followed by movements into trades and businesses. This model of education was adopted throughout the Western world, including the United States. Rights of women were, as part of this process, taken away in all this, and society was also cleansed of many unwanted persons, the homeless, the gypsies, the Jews, homosexuals, and others. Thus, the workforce came to serve the interest of powerful and militaristic states. The best example of this became fascist Germany. And unfortunately, many other modern governments continue to follow their lead. Tyson next discusses what he calls extracognitive aspects of consciousness, knowledge, and knowledge transmission. He points to the undomesticated mind of small children. How do they know how to do new tasks? How do they remember so much? I have grandchildren. It's fascinating to watch them. They're like brilliant, but they kind of know nothing at the same time. He says this explosive period of learning ends in industrial societies about the age of 8, when, quote, the highly focused attention of play and learning is schooled out of the child and redirected to less stimulating educational activity, unquote. Failing to continue use of the undomesticated parts of our brains leads to loss of function. But he surmises that, quote, reclaiming of indigenous ritual and cultural activities as exercises in concentration may be just what is needed to grow or repair the minds required to create complex solutions for sustainability issues, unquote. In other words, hopefully we can get back to the sorts of extracognitive activity that is important for union with the land. These extracognitive abilities might be how animals, I think including us, may know ancient migration routes, or how women intuitively just know things. He says indigenous people are aware of these extracognitive abilities, which could include, gut instinct, we might refer to it as that, or learning or deciding once one sleeps on it. He says this type of knowledge is unsettling to hierarchies, but unseen inner and outer worlds are part of Aboriginal knowledge transmission all over Australia. He views much of modern work, tasks and roles, or jobs, to be unnecessary and unnatural. He says, quote, we will endure longer work hours than our roles require today for reasons of social control rather than productivity. We still endure longer work hours than our roles require. He says that, quote, jobs are not really what we want. We want shelter, food, strong relationships, a livable habitat, stimulating learning activity, and time to perform valued tasks in which we excel. He says, quote, this life of work or die is not an improvement on pre-invasion living, which involved a few hours of work a day for shelter and sustenance, performing tasks that people now do for leisure activities on their vacations, fishing, collecting plants, hunting, camping, and so forth. The rest of the day in indigenous societies was for fun, strengthening relationships, ritual, ceremony, cultural expression, intellectual pursuits, and expert crafting of exceptional objects. He says, I know this is true because I have lived like this. Tyson feels that civilization oppresses people through scarcity paradigms, while indigenous are really free societies based on paradigms of abundance, and I would add gratitude. He also suggests that all of us have access to all the memories of our lives, which likely are not in our brains, but we can access if we use these facilities, if we tap into these unconscious knowledge systems. On a societal basis, civilized cultures can lose their collective memories. That seems pretty obvious to me. here, which may take thousands of years to regain without assistance. It's an interesting perspective. He says, quote, "The assistance I'm talking about comes from sharing patterns of knowledge and ways of thinking that will help trigger the ancestral knowledge hidden inside. The assistance people need is not in learning about Aboriginal knowledge, but in remembering their own." Tyson also has an interesting perspective on knowledge transmission. He says that the only sustainable way to store knowledge long term is in relationships. Deep, quote, "deep connections between generations of people in custodial relation to a sentient landscape, all grounded in a vibrant oral tradition," unquote. He calls oral cultures high context cultures, whereas print-based cultures are low context because they focus on ideas and objects in isolation. Western thought has people focus on the task at hand at the direction of their leaders rather than the purpose of their work. He says consensus and consent are unnecessary in low context cultures where reasoning is hierarchical, solitary, and disconnected, with one-way communications or orders. He says, quote, "Conversely, high context cultures demand dialogue and complex agreements." He says that cultures can lose their high context cognitive function when deeply engaged in the global economic system. That makes sense to me. This is significant with respect to child rearing. In high context Indigenous cultures, children have many caregivers in extended families. But in low context cultures, there are only one or two primary caregivers. Children come to school with, quote, "adaptive, collective, complex, and intensely situated logic patterns," unquote. But that is not consistent with orderly classrooms where they can be punished for their normal, natural behavior. I think of the way I grew up and my children and their children, and it seems he would say we are in a low context culture. It's an interesting way to think of ourselves in this modern world. He also talks about kinship pairs, with the mother and child being the most important, kinship pair, protected by the men as brothers, fathers, uncles, cousins, and grandfathers. Civilized society has lost this instruction. And he says, you can't maintain a culture that is based on retarding the development of half the population, women, particularly when that half is responsible for creating life. Civilized cultures have transformed traditional men, who he says are tender, empathetic, and nurturing, and women who actually are strong, determined decision makers, where women are subjugated and forced to be passive physically and intellectually as well. This seems right to me. In Indigenous cultures, relationships among men and women are much more free, and it was never the role of men to subjugate women who controlled, for example, nutrition in the local communities. The burden of patriarchy affects every person in modern cultures, and it is necessary to break free of this contravention of the normal order if the desire is to be sustainable. He says that if one is living a life without violence, one is living an illusion, essentially outsourcing conflict, sort of the natural, normal conflict that's in life as one might call this the cycle of killing and eating. You're outsourcing this conflict to others, such as those in the Southern Hemisphere. Our clean cities can thank poor areas for, as he says, quote, taking those blows for you, as are the economically marginalized who fill your prisons. Domesticated humans simply live stripped of the reality of violence and, quote, become passive recipients of violence, either its benefits or its cruel impacts. They devolve as a result. He says, quote, I often wonder what men and women would transform into outside of their captivity, meaning captivity in our modern, low-context, economically based civilizations. Finally, he says, there are a lot of opportunities for sustainable innovations through dialogue between indigenous and non-indigenous knowledge systems that might help civilization transition into sustainable ways of living. A good place to start, he says, is to learn to appreciate our relationship to place, where we are, where we live, the ground we walk on. Quote, being in profound relation to place changes everything about you, your voice, your smell, your walk, your morality. I think this really means understanding, we can understand our extra cognitive relationship with the earth and all of our non-hierarchical relatives. I'm continuing to try to understand what Tyson Yunkaporta is saying in this book, Sand Talk. I know there is a lot I do not understand. I am a product of the colonized world, colonizer thinking. I am trying to grasp and understand the benefits of indigenous thought. But I tend to agree with him when he says indigenous thinking can save the world. As a matter of fact, I think it may be the only thing that can save the world. How we go about having these conversations, I don't know. And all I can do is throw these words out into the ether and hope others will feel them. Thank you. Namaste.